It's amber in color, it's not cracked or broken, it's securely mounted, and it's functioning properly. It also serves as my left turn signal and my four-way flasher. We're going to move to our mirror bracket. Make sure that it's not cracked or broken, it's securely mounted. Make sure there's no missing bolts on my mirror bracket. I'm going to move to the door. I'm going to start with the handle, make sure it's not cracked or broken, make sure it's securely mounted. I'm going to make sure my door opens and closes properly. When I open the door, I'm going to be checking my hinges. I'm going to check the hinges and make sure they're not cracked or broken, they're securely mounted, make sure there's no missing bolts on my hinges. I'm also going to be checking the weather stripping around the cab and around the door itself to make sure that it's not dry rotted, make sure it's in good condition. I'm going to move to my steps. I'm going to make sure the steps are not cracked or broken, securely mounted, no missing bolts. Also make sure there's no slippery substances on my steps, such as oil, ice, or water, okay? When I flip down my little thing here, I'm going to check my depth tank. Okay, I'm going to check the depth tank to make sure it's not cracked or broken, make sure it's securely mounted, make sure that it's not leaking. My depth should be no less than 1/8 of a tank. I'm going to move back here. Now I'm going to go to my catwalk and steps. My catwalk and steps, make sure they're not cracked or broken, make sure they're securely mounted, no missing bolts on my catwalk and my steps, make sure there's no slippery substances as well. I'm going to move to my fuel tank. I'm going to check the fuel tank to make sure it's not cracked or broken, make sure it's securely mounted, make sure that it's not leaking. I'm going to check the straps on my fuel tank to make sure they're secure, not cracked, make sure there's a rubber seal in between to prevent any metal on metal friction. I'm going to check my fuel cap itself. Make sure it's not cracked or broken, make sure it's secure, make sure it's not leaking. When I open my fuel cap, I should have a T-bar chain on the inside and a rubber seal. I'm going to move down in between my frame down here. I have my drive shaft. My drive shaft down there, make sure that it's not cracked or broken, make sure it's secure, free of any debris. I'm going to check the U-joints on both ends of my drive shaft as well to make sure they're not cracked or broken, make sure they're properly lubed. Also down there I have my exhaust and my DPF filter. My exhaust, I will make sure that it's not cracked or broken, make sure it's securely mounted, no signs of leaks, which will be rust or carbon soot. I would also check my DPF filter back there to make sure that it's not cracked, broken, make sure it's secure, make sure that it's not leaking. I'm going to check my frame. I will check the frame to make sure it's not bent, cracked, or broken, make sure there's no illegal holes or illegal welds on my frame. From there, we're going to move to the second axle, and we're going to do the suspension. I'm going to start out with my spring mount, my torque spring mount. Make sure that it's not cracked or broken. Make sure it's securely mounted. Make sure there's no missing bolts on my torque spring mount. Then I have the torque spring. Make sure that it's not cracked or broken. Make sure it's securely mounted and not shifted. I have my, you're not going to be able to see it, but my U-bolts are down there. Make sure my U-bolts are not cracked or broken, securely mounted. No missing nuts on the U-bolts. I'm going to check my shock absorber. Make sure the shock absorber is not cracked or broken. Make sure it's securely mounted, no missing bolts. Also make sure it's not leaking. I have my airbag. I'm going to check the airbag, make sure there's no abrasions, bubbles, cuts, or leaks. Make sure it's securely mounted. That's my suspension. Now I'm going to move into the braking system. Obviously, you're not going to see any of these parts, okay? So I'm going to start with my brake hose. I want to make sure the brake hose has no abrasions, bubbles, cuts, or leaks. I want to make sure it's securely mounted on both ends. I'm going to check my brake chamber. Make sure the brake chamber is not cracked or broken. Make sure it's securely mounted. Make sure that it's not leaking. Then I have my brake chamber clamp. I'm going to make sure my brake chamber clamp is not cracked or broken and secure tight around the brake chamber. I have my slack adjuster back there. I want to make sure that it's not cracked or broken and securely mounted with a cotter pin. I have my push rod. My push rod should not be bent, cracked, or broken, and it should be secure, and it should have no more than 2 inches of travel when the brakes are released and pulled by hand. 1 inch in the front.
So there's 2 back here, and then you go 3?
No, 2 inches here, 2 inches there.
Okay.
One on your first axle. I have my brake drum. I want to make sure the brake drum is not cracked or broken. Make sure there's no bluing or glazing on my brake drum, which would be indication of overheating brakes. I'm going to check my brake lining. The brake lining should not be cracked, broken, or separated, and it should be no less than 1/4 of an inch at its most thinnest point. That's my braking system. Then we're going to move to the tires, okay? For my tires, I'm going to be using the ICD method, inflation, condition, and depth. For my inflation, I can check the side tire wall for the manufacturer specification. I will use a commercial air gauge at my valve stem, somewhere here, at my valve stem. While I'm there, I will check the valve stem to make sure it's not cracked or broken, make sure it's secure, make sure it's not leaking, and it should have a DOT approved cap on the valve stem. As far as my condition, I'm going to check the outer and the inner wall, make sure there's no abrasions, bubbles, cuts, or leaks. I want to make sure I have an evenly worn tread pattern. On my second axle, these are allowed recaps and retreads, but no mismatched tires. As far as my depth on my second axle should be no less than 2/32 of tread. Also, since I have dual tires here, I'm going to be checking my bud spacing. I'm going to check the bud spacing to make sure that it's free of any trash or debris. I want to make sure I have an even gap all the way around, and I will check the rims to make sure they're butted flat against each other. I'm going to move to my lug nuts and my studs. My lug nuts and studs, make sure that none are missing, make sure they're all secure and tight. Any signs of looseness will be rust or shiny spots behind the lug nut. Now I have my axle seal. I'm going to check the axle seal to make sure it's not cracked or broken, make sure it's securely mounted. I want to make sure that it's not leaking. From there, we're going to move to our splash guards. Okay, I want to make sure they're not cracked, not ripped, torn, or frayed. I want to make sure they're securely mounted. It has that cotter pin. Make sure it has DOT approved reflector tape. Also, I want to make sure it's covering both tires. It should be no lower than 2 inches off the ground, no higher than 8 inches off the ground. From there, we're going to move to the rear of the tractor. We're going to check the lights in the rear of my tractor. The lights on the rear of my tractor, they function as my tail lights, my brake lights, my left, right turn signal, and four-way flashers. They should be red in color, not cracked or broken, securely mounted, and they should be working properly. Also, back here, I have my reverse light. My reverse light is going to be white in color, not cracked or broken, securely mounted, and it should be functioning properly. So that's Form B. Did you guys want me to do the coupling as well?
Yes, please.
Form B.